Great science fiction is about more than escapist fantasies of starships and exotic aliens fighting battles in distant galaxies beyond our solar system. In the proper hands, science fiction can help us reimagine our own reality in subversive ways, provide insightful social commentary about the real world we inhabit every day. Augmented, Volume 1, is a new collection of great science fiction stories that invite us to take a closer look at ourselves and the world around us. Augmented, Volume 1, a short story anthology of great science fiction stories available now on Amazon.
All right, everyone. Welcome back to a series of audio recording files that we like to call the Jonathan_Foster podcast. And we're going to have a good time today. This is it's season 8 is what I like to call it. And it's a season that I think we're pretty much almost every episode. I know there's one that doesn't exactly fall into this category, but we're pretty much every episode going to talk about open and relational theology, everyone's favorite theological paradigm. And lots of good stuff already happening. And today we have a repeat guest, Dr. Thomas Jay Oord, who is hanging out with us. How you doing, Tom?
Doing well.
All right. Glad to hear it. So we're going to get to him in a moment, but a couple of things. First of all, if you like the show, I don't know why in the world you wouldn't take 5 seconds and hit some thumbs up, some stars, some likes, whatever it is that you do in your particular podcasting platform. That would be helpful. And also, if you like anything I have to say during this podcast, track me down at jonathanfosteronline.com. If you like the stuff Tom has to say, you know what? Just Google Tom Oord, and he's freaking everywhere on the internet. So you're not going to miss him. But I'd love to connect with you. You can jump on my Substack, maybe find out about some stuff we're doing in Haiti, maybe buy a book or two. But thanks so much for being here. Now, today, and the season is pretty fun, Tom, because not only are we talking open and relational theology this season, I just feel like, I'm always feeling like, how can we get more of a feminine presence into the show and into any of the work that I do? So I had a brilliant idea. Why don't I invite some female friends to co-host with me on a few of these episodes? So I thought of my friend Libby Tedder Hugus, who is, of course, a mutual friend of ours. And we invited Libby to come on today. And Libby has been a pastor. She's an open and relational thinker and theologian. She is a life coach as a Resonant Live. Is that what it is, Libby?
resonatenow.live.
resonatenow.live. I will put her bio in the show notes, but thanks so much for being with us, Libby. And do you want to fill in any of the blanks that I obviously left a lot of blanks out there in terms of who you are and what you're up to?
Yeah, thanks so much for the chance to co-host with you today, Jonathan, and for the invitation for the feminine and the divine feminine to rise and be heard and to partner with divine masculine. I think that's an incredible way to be in the world, creating room for more folks at all the tables, including the Jonathan_Foster podcast table.
That's right.
Howdy, folks out there in the interwebs. My name is Libby Tedder Hugus, and I show up in the world as a human resonator, a spiritual midwife, and a wordsmith. So I offer my presence to the world as a mental fitness coach, as a public, open, and relational theologian, as a reverend, as an author, and a speaker. And I am the lead mental fitness coach at resonatenow.live. That's where you can find me on the magic of the interwebs right now. I, like Jonathan mentioned, was the founding pastor of The Table, a radically inclusive spiritual community in Casper, Wyoming, that lived a beautiful lifespan for a decade and created space for doubters and disciples to belong, be loved, and be nourished. And it has now been tucked into bed for a well-deserved slumber. So it is now resting, and eventually, we're looking for new narratives around this. But I think eventually it will be buried, returned to the earth, and that fruit will begin to bear fertile fruit and seeds in other ways. It's already doing that, but our community needed some space to sort of have an in-between. And now I am really showing up to own my own coaching business and be present to mental fitness coaching, which my mission behind that coaching business is that I believe that personal transformation leads to communal transformation. And all of that is rooted in open and relational theology and how God moves in our world. So that's a little bit about me and how I show up.
That's great. And you got kids and a partner.
I do. My people. So I have an incredible life partner named Jeremy, who's kicking butt and taking names as an awesome business owner in Casper, Wyoming, and 2 incredible human daughters. And they're 3 and 6, and we're loving watching them flourish as 2 wildly different human beings who are guiding our journey on this planet too, and helping us steward what we're creating as parents. They're such cool humans to be on planet Earth with.
I need to make a slight correction, though, Jonathan.
Okay.
Earlier, when you were introducing the podcast, you talked about mutual friends, and that label just doesn't seem to get at the depth of the relationships the 3 of us have. So, Jonathan, you and I are very good friends. We've worked together on lots of projects, the Sacrisage Press, the doctoral program. But I've known Libby for a lot longer than I've known you. Mm-hmm. I met her in Nampa, Idaho, when she came in as a college student and sat in my classes. And then I had the honor of officiating her marriage to Jeremy. I know her kids, her family. She's like one of the most important persons in the world to me. And so this is like mutual friends isn't nearly deep enough for what the 3 of us got going here today.
That is true. I stand corrected. Thank you for finessing that language. And yeah, very true. A lot of good stuff resonating here. And thanks for hanging out with me for a little bit. So we don't have much of a script, but I do have a couple things I want to ask to get this stuff going. So I'm going to set up this first question for Tom by saying that previously on the podcast, we got a chance to hang out with another mutual friend, Dr. Andrew Davis. And so I heard Andrew at OrtCon in 2022, which, side note, OrtCon is Open Relational Theological Conference. It's our in-person conference. And, now that I'm saying this is a good time to remind everyone they should come hang out with us July 8 through 12 at the Tetons. I mean, you get to talk open and relational theology, hang out with people like the 3 of us, and you're in the mountains. I don't know what else do you want? It is genuinely one of my favorite times of the year. Anyhow, and go to just Google OrtCon 24. I'll put the show links in the show notes. I'll put the links in the show notes. That's my answer for everything. When I have guests on and I haven't done the proper work, I just go, Google it. You'll be fine. So anyhow, I heard Andrew in 2022 he called them 10, I think, Whiteheadian transitions that were helpful to be thinking through. And I have not forgotten that for almost a couple of years. So I asked him to come on. And there was a ton of stuff, obviously, as we all know, that you could talk to Andrew about because he's a well-learned individual. But these things have just been stuck in the back of my mind. They were super helpful. And so we kind of framed it as, yes, 10 Whiteheadian transitions, but the way I look at it is kind of 10 transitions that have been happening in our society, in our culture, that make it like a really good time for open and relational theology to make sense in our world. Okay, that's the longest setup to a question ever. Several things to promote during that question. I'm a professional. See how that works? I'm not going to read all 10 of them to you, Tom, but I'm going to read a few of them. And I just want you to pick out 1, maybe 2, that strike you as being, that's really interesting. And that makes a lot of sense. And I'd like to drop some golden dewdrops of wisdom on that stuff, or platinum dewdrops. Okay, here, I'll just read a few. the transition from being to becoming, you have to remember these, from mechanism to organism, that might be something you want to talk about. The transition from force to persuasion. I'll give you one more. From passivity to creativity. You want to hear them again?
Oh, I think I can go with it.
You got one of those you want to talk about? Why?
Sure.
Why does it make sense, and why does it resonate with you with respect to open and relational theology?
First of all, let me say that 10 transitions, that's a lot, and it shows you the importance of a theoretical framework if it can reach out into all dimensions of life and propose nourishing and sensible ways of addressing those areas of life. And so I'm sure if Andrew wanted to, he could add more to those 10, but it's a credit to a way of thinking that it affects so many dimensions of our living. But amongst those 10, the one that actually jumped out at me was from mechanism to organism. I've written an awful lot about from force to persuasion. So let me talk about mechanism to organism. I think we, at least I and many people in the contemporary world, have come to think about causation primarily in terms of an external object having some kind of impact upon another external object. And so causation is kind of like dominoes or billiard balls or rocks coming off and hitting another rock. And we've thought of causation like that instead of thinking about it in terms of the interiority of life, especially organisms, people, creatures of various kinds. And if we start with the interiority, and by which I mean the decisions, the mentality, the thinking, the spontaneity, the ingenuity and creativity that are present in what exists, then all of a sudden we start to think about life permeating existence, not just human life, not even just other animals, but life at the micro level. And I think that gives us a much better picture of what's happening in the world. In fact, when we think about mechanism, it's probably best to think about that as organisms that are organized in ways that are inanimate, rather than thinking that we start from inanimate stuff and then somehow, surprisingly, organisms come from it. So that's my first launch into response. Nice.
And so how does that help us with theology, with your thinking regarding God?
Well, I think what it does is it means that not only should we think about theology as creaturely responses to the world, the environment, and to God, we should think about this God perhaps acting in ways that, well, the Whiteheadian language would be lure organisms and lure creatures to better things, greater values, love, beauty, justice, compassion, etc. Or to use the language of a person the three of us are admirers of, John Wesley, God woos us, woos creation, woos organisms toward what's better, toward, in classic Christian language, the kingdom of God, or well-being, or flourishing.
Yeah, I know that means a lot to me personally, the invitational piece of all of that versus this mechanistic system that God started and is kind of forcing everything to go one particular way. I think love is just way more creative than all of that. So
yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah, that's nice. Libby, how has this played out in your life, and what kind of coals do you want to rake Tom over with respect to theology?
Yeah, thanks for that invitation. As you were naming these 10 transitions and asking for Tom to pick up on one of them, I was thinking about just the threshold of change and what it means to find ourselves crossing from sort of one era into a new era. And as a mental fitness coach now, what my work primarily is in helping people get unstuck from overwhelm. So convincing them that the change that they're seeking in whatever area where they're overwhelmed or stuck is not mechanistic. It's organism based on the relationship that they have to self, others, God, earth, and the systems in which they're stuck, or the organizations in which they're stuck in seeking change. So, Tom, I have a curiosity then around sort of the trampoline, the jumping off point that open and relational provides for that internal dialogue that you referenced earlier of the integrity of intelligence centers. So let me sort of give context to what I mean there and see if this question makes sense. Pastorally, when I was working at the table, and now as I work with folks in groups coaching and one-on-one coaching, I've come to recognize that there are sort of three intelligence centers. There's the intelligence center of the mind, which in Western culture, we've gotten really overly identified with. We've gotten really over-identified with the way the brain works and the mind works and the thoughts that are constantly racing. And then there's the intelligence center of the heart. There's the intelligence center of emotions and reading the experiences that we're having in the world. And finally, there's the intelligence center of the gut, that intuition, which interestingly in our Hebrew faith tradition, there's a lot of references in Hebrew scripture to feeling things in our gut and knowing things in our gut. Well, modern science is now telling us that a lot of our neurobiology starts with our gut biome. So if our gut biome is healthy, our intelligence center is healthy. So we then see the internal relationship between all three of these intelligence centers. So my curiosity then is, how do you perceive open and relational theology as a jumping off point for integrity of internal relationship? Does the question make sense?
I think I understand what you're saying. Yeah. And I'm fully on board with the, centers of intelligence, the view that is not held by everybody in open and relational theology, but a lot of people of panpsychism or pan-experientialism, or what I like to call mental material monism, says that there's mentality throughout all that exists. And that's kind of like talking about intelligence, in particular parts of our bodies and creation. And I think part of your question, if I understand it correctly, is asking the question of how one then thinks about these differing ways of knowing, differing ways of living in the world based on the information, the choices, the intelligence, the intuitions that we have that make up who we are. And I'm totally with you in saying that we have typically put the focus on the mind as what intelligence is all about. But if we think very hard, we know that we are very strongly influenced by our emotions, by our intuitions, our feelings, and what you call the gut, or I think in the scriptures it's more like the bowels, which sounds kind of gross.
Yes.
The gut is better.
It does. Yeah.
Or it's like what's the Body Knows the Score author
Vanderkirk.
Yeah, there we go.
Vanderkirk.
Yeah, he's identifying something that in open and relational theology we've been talking about for a long, long time. And that is that if you have an organismic view of the human, of the universe, but let's just focus on the human here for a moment, then the interrelatedness and the activity that makes up who we are is going to be influenced by all parts of our bodies, our brain, mind, gut, heart, legs, toes. I've been dealing with the cold here recently, and boy, my nose gets a lot of influence in my body these days. So all these things together then have to be taken into account if we're going to give any kind of accurate assessment of what we are, what we want to do, what's going on in the world. And I think that can help us avoid two extremes. One extreme identified more with the mechanistic view, is the extreme that says we don't have any real options. Who we are, not only how we think, but our bodies are entirely determined by forces beyond our influence. And we're machines. That's the mechanistic view. But the other view, sometimes what people will put on the table, kind of makes it sound as if we have no real boundaries whatsoever, and we're just free to do absolutely anything. We're not relational people. And I think the middle way says we do have options and possibilities. Our bodies both place constraints on those options, but also facilitate or spur on. Options emerge from our relations within our bodies. And as a what's the mental coach? What's the phrase you use?
Mental fitness coaching.
Mental fitness coach. It seems like some people are going to be stuck in thinking they don't have any options, but maybe some other people need to realize the options they have to be conducive to the person they are and the bodies they have and what's happened to them in their history, their traumas, their victories, etc.
I love that. And as a follow-up to that, I think we're open and relational. We're encountering you all those years ago in undergrad, and the way that you helped me reorient my faith practice and my theological understanding as a student, which then blossomed into the entire life that I've lived since then, Tom, is that open and relational theology gives us the loving compass point by which to say we have a grounded theory here of the fact that God is love. And if God is love, then we're going to fill in the blank, and the compass point is going to become love. So an example of that is I'm currently involved in a coach's training this week, and the facilitator was giving an example of some students that were put in to two different coaching scenarios. One was a performance-based coaching, and one, I'm going to forget exactly what it was, but it was like, let's call it life-based coaching versus performance-based coaching. And they were given the same problem to dialogue with two different coaches. And afterward, they studied the parts of their brains that were lit up after those experiences. And the students gave feedback that they felt an underlying shame and guilt with the performance coach versus the life coach scenario. And so where open and relational theology then comes into how you explained that is that it gives us the gift of reorienting the relationships that we have internally and externally. So I'm sort of nerding out about neuroscience right now as a mental fitness coach and helping my clients listen to dial up the internal dialogue of love and dial down the internal dialogue of fear. Now, evolutionary science tells us that the sort of fear-based survival mode, depending on our life experiences, our epigenetics, our generational sort of backgrounds, as well as the traumas and experiences that we've had in our life, are going to build up to hinder us from like getting stuck in a sabotage loop. But there are ways to quiet the sabotage loops and give greater volume to the sage loops, the love loops, the open fuel systems that say there's more to the story than just a fear-based experience. So a question then for you on your experience is like, maybe we'll make it personal. What are practices that you use to make sure that you're listening to the love voice in your internal system, your brain, your gut, your heart, rather than the fear-based system? How do you practice that in your life?
Yeah, there's a bunch of things. Some of them are very intentional. Others just have kind of emerged in my life over time. The ones that have kind of emerged have to do with the kinds of reading I do and the people that I talk with that are just a part of my everyday life as a professor now. Some of the more, you might call them intentional practices are I do a breathing prayer where I symbolically breathe in God and then breathe out love or breathe out my intentions for the day. You know, the old chevron things I used to use in class, like God acts first. That's me breathing in love. And then my response, that's me breathing in God, I should say. And my response then is breathing out love. So I do that as a practice. I as you know, I hike as a practice and get outdoors in nature. That's super important for me. And that involves photography, so an artistic element that has been really helpful and made me think about creativity in new ways, including, well, I could go on and on about photography, so I'll just say one quick thing, including the classic view of artists that you have a muse. And many Christians have equated that with God. And I've come to think that, although I do think God influences me, that using that muse language might be a good way to talk about some of the, what you called intelligences, but to posit them not necessarily in me, but somehow beyond me and transcending me, and therefore in some sense influencing me in that creative process. But I digress. Although nothing is a digression. Other practices, I exercise. That's really important for me to in my attempt to be a holy person. Exercise is a big deal. Reading, and here
Yeah.
I'll say one last thing. And my wife is going to laugh if she hears this. One of my holy practices is to go to bed early at night.
Yes.
I'm a better person if I sleep.
Yeah. In just a minute, I'll toss it back to you, Jonathan. But I think like what I'm hearing there and what I'm hearing in sort of a theme that's emerging from this mechanistic to organism transition that sort of the world is primed for right now, and the way that open and relational theology is sort of providing context and nest to that, is what I would call like an embodiment that honors the way that our body is giving us clues, language, need to relate well to ourselves so we can relate well to others, right? And open relational theology says that like God wills for us to flourish and to add to the flourishing of those around us. And something in this piece of history has like diminished our ability to honor our own wellness as adding to the wellness of the world, and that those are all interconnected, right? So thinking about this inclusion of the feminine in your work, Jonathan, then like that is a major learning curve that I have come on in my journey as being an embodied female, of what does it mean to honor the needs that I have, the emotions that talk to me and speak to me, and how filling up the wellness of my relationality then spills over into and resonates with everybody around me, professionally, familial, nature, creation, all of the things.
The integration of all that, and what I heard you say is something about, like, I'm thinking of harmonies, and as you live inside this world, you're creating something that is harmonizing with the world and tying it together to this invitational lure of God. There's something about all that in open relational theology that's helped me see that love is so creative. It can bring potentially the best out in all of us. And it doesn't have to hurt one person or one thing or one people group in order to get the best out of the other people group. Simone Weil says something like that, God does no violence to secondary means to the accomplishment of his will or something. It's probably not the exact way I would say it, but that was really helpful for me to come across that kind of thinking. And I love that. I think that's really important. I don't have a question, Tom. Do you have a comment on that?
Well, I was thinking about what you guys were talking about and thinking that one of the, I think, beauties of open and relational theology is you can throw any subject you could possibly imagine at me, and I will figure out a way to weave in open and relational thinking without reducing everything to, well, it must be God. Like some traditions, you throw out some subject and they say, well, that's God. And that's kind of the end of the piece. But in open and relational theology, because we think we are creatures with autonomy, at least relative autonomy and decision making, and we live in a world that's organismic rather than mechanistic, that God is active but not controlling, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we can take seriously whatever topic you want to talk about on its own terms, but also see real links to the overarching themes in open and relational theology.
Yeah, I noticed that right at the beginning as I started dipping my toes into it. Like there's way less, it's not territorial. People don't push back when you start talking about new ideas because it's so fluid and again, not mechanistic, like it's all entangled. It's really fun to be a part of a thinking paradigm that doesn't have to be defensive.
Yeah. Today I spent my morning doing the audio files for the book that Trip Fuller and I have just published called God After Deconstruction. And one of the chapters near the end is on religious pluralism in many religions. And I was trying to explain how in open and relational theology, I can be a Christian and celebrate the truths I find in Islam, Buddhism, Baha'i, whatever, sometimes seeing similarities between their views of God and my views of God, but other times acknowledging that what they're talking about as ultimate reality can also fit the portions of ultimate reality I find in open and relational thinking. And so instead of being a competition, is a kind of complementariness without me having to say, well, I just think Christianity is just as good as any other faith, because in reality, I don't. I'm a follower of Jesus because I think that's the preferable way, but that's not dismissive of everybody else as if we've got the only thing. We're the exclusively right thing. Or sometimes people dismiss other religions by saying, well, all the truth that you have, we really have in our religion, just better. I don't have to go that route either. And that's really freeing when you want to live a life of love and be in real conversation with those of other faith traditions.
When love is the fuel and defenses are brought down, then the conversation becomes, what do we hold in common in having common desires? So we used to talk about this in the faith community that I led all of the time, that we wanted to belong. Like, we have a common desire to belong, we have a common desire to be loved, and we have a common need to be nourished. And when we hold those three things in common, then the conversation becomes so different. I'll share a little anecdotal story about what I think you were illustrating there, Tom, from our faith community that's now circling back around to this mental fitness coaching business. So we had a partnership, our New Worshiping community had a partnership with the Casper the Casper Art Walk. And the Art Walk was something that happened sort of like May, June, July, August in our town. That was sort of a first Thursdays event in our downtown community. Various art galleries would open, but then other venues that wanted to host various kinds of artists would host it and be open in the evening, and folks would walk the downtown sort of corridors and stop in and visit different artists and artist receptions. And we had an artist approach us about a series that she had done as a personal response to the 2016 American elections. And she called it The Portraits of Love. And she did 8 portraits of various living and dead folks that represented to her embodying love. Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr., the Dalai Lama, Princess Diana, John Lennon, and Jesus. And so we hosted her, and she talked about her experience and how that helped her to channel and counteract the rage and lament that she was feeling over the 2016 national elections. And then my husband and partner in life, being the brilliant human that he was, his business bought that series and donated it to the table. So we then utilized it a couple of different times in our community. Well, now that our community has gone into slumber, that came back to live at our house, and we just installed that in our dining room. And so now the series is in our home dining room with these gorgeous portraits on the wall. And I think what it illustrates is what you were just trying to say, that the Jesus narrative for you is your home base. The Jesus narrative for us in open and relational theology is a home base. But as we're discovering at Ortline and in previous conversations, it's also happening among atheists. It's also happening among Muslims. It's also happening in all of these other spaces, because it gives us the compass point of saying there's more to the loving conversation than the fear-based conversation. There's more to the where is love taking us and how is love nourishing us, which is why it's in our dining room, than there is to the how can we build the keep out, keep in walls around us. So just a little anecdote of how that took place in our community and is continuing to take place.
I like it.
That's awesome. You know, a couple of things. First of all, a very similar story with me with respect to artwork in our church plant out in Arizona. Years ago, I was in another church in Southern Cal, and I think Wyatt Anderson, I think that's the artist's name, and he had this beautiful painting of the Last Supper, but it was with Jesus with 12 different like Native American tribes or Latin American tribes. It's so cool. And I made the comment to someone, if I plant a church, we need to put that in the lobby. And so that's what happened. People found out about it, they bought it, and then years later when we left, we got this painting, and it doesn't fit in our kitchen is the only thing. It's like 15 feet long, and it's like 15 by probably 24 inches or something, but it does fit out in our little cabin in Colorado. So that's just funny how these things work, doesn't it? You get to keep this stuff. But I want to back up because I want to comment on the freedom thing. I want to take it further. You said commonality. Here's how much freedom, that sounded kind of arrogant. I don't mean to say that I have more freedom than other people, but this is my experience with, I think, love and open and relational stuff, and also my work with mimetic theories. Like, I actually have peace now about saying not only common, I might actually be wrong. I don't even know for sure. So I think in terms of like, there's usually 4 different movements that us religious people go on. The first is, I'm right, you're wrong. The second is, and then of course we have to convert them. The second is, we can't convert them. So I'm right, you're still wrong, but I just disown you. The third is, you know what? You might be right and I might be right. Well, the thing that's true about all 3 of those is I still get to be right. The fourth might be, oh crap, I'm wrong and you're right. And I think about that little movement often, and how, of course, I don't want to be wrong. And if you ask my partner, she'll tell you that that's true. But I have a lot more, open and relational theology has helped me integrate that into my thinking. I find that really, really helpful. Again, Tom, no question, just comment.
Yeah. Well, I think of it not as saying I'm wrong and saying that in terms of I've got no truth to offer here, or no vision of reality that might be truer than another. I think of it more in terms of, here is what seems the most plausible to me, but I could be wrong.
Right.
And the reason I like sort of making a more constructive claim about the possibility of truth is that I find some people who rightly reject the absolutism of their youth and the churches perhaps they were from, now kind of are in this land where they don't want to make any kind of value claims about one thing being better than another, because they don't want to go back to that absolutism, and they're not sure, they're tempted by a kind of an extreme relativism. At least mentally they're tempted by that. when in reality, we all live as if we prefer some things over others. So why not have a coherent framework to try to make sense of those intuitions, all the while being humble that we're never going to know truth fully, and we always should say, I'm not sure, but this proposal seems a little better than any of the others that I know.
Yeah, I like that. You just said what I wanted to say better, as usual.
I think that where my brain goes there is around the power of curiosity and hypothesis, right? So to say, like, I think I know this much, but I'm going to be curious about how this plays out when I try it out in the world, when I actually take a hypothesis that seems true in my brain based on my experience in life and throw the spaghetti at the wall, see what sticks. Because I know enough about throwing spaghetti at the wall, I believe that it's going to stick in this way. And if it sticks in this way, it's going to say this much about lived experience. So coming out of a place of sort of humble curiosity and wanting to see how the thing relating to its environment then blossoms into the version of plant or this version of flower because you planted such and such a seed in such a soil. So that's where my head goes, is to curiosity and hypothesis testing.
Yeah, and so there's kind of an empirical result there. Now you have to interpret that result, so it's still not you're going to get the absolute truth, and that's part of the curiosity as well. I think also now you're getting me rolling, Libby and Jonathan. I really don't like the search for absolute certainty. Actually, it's not really a search for some people. They just think they've got the absolute certainty. And so many people today see the problems with that approach. But then at least in religious circles, primarily Christian ones, since those are the circles I spend most of my time in, the alternative seems to be a kind of claim for mystery. And I call it absolute mystery. And it's a good corrective because it's moving from certainty to uncertainty, to the curiosity you mentioned. But sometimes that mystery claim has no real constructive teeth to it. And it kind of stops the conversation. So, you respond by saying, well, it's just a mystery. And that bothers me because I think Scripture is right that without a vision, the people will perish. We need to have some kind of framework or proposal on the table that goes beyond just absolute mystery, but not a framework we know is certainty, some kind of way of thinking that might motivate us to what we think is most important. And for, I think, the three of us, love is at least one of, if not the most important thing in life. So we need to have a proposal related to love that can inspire us in ways that I think appeals to absolute mystery probably aren't going to be inspiring.
Jonathan, so where my curiosity gets piqued based on that response, Tom, is then the transition of being to becoming. Because if we're coming from a place of absolute certainty, then we have a closed loop system. If we're transitioning into a becoming, then we're saying we can't know what the future holds, but we're not going to release that to some sort of mysterious outcome. We're going to aim for a thing that then allows us to live into and grow into that becoming. That transition, takes out the using mystery as what's that word? Excuse.
Absolutely. And it places it back on just the everyday moment by moment becoming and the change and how dynamic all of that is. It just seems like it's a more enjoyable, again, curious, interesting place to live that unfortunately a lot of our religious ideological thinking doesn't allow us to get to. It reminds me, for Girard, he calls ideology a closed system of desire. So you're not allowed to desire anything outside of the system. And so it's just desires pinging around inside this little thing. And well, obviously, as the name open and relational implies, it's not a closed thing, man. There is no ceiling here. All kinds of change could happen. And I just think that's a beautiful picture of not only humanity, but all of creation and maybe God herself. It's pretty cool. Tom, let's turn the corner just a little bit. I know we're starting to push an hour. We'll go a little bit longer here, but you wrote a book recently called The Death of Omnipotence, The Birth of Amipotence, being the dramatic person that you are. Death of Omnipotence. I will say that I was surprised by a lot of things when I started moving into ORT world. And one of them was definitely, like, the thought didn't even cross my mind probably 10 years ago that omnipotence was really a problematic thing. But man, once I got into it, it's like, oh my word, there's so many issues here. So tell us a little bit about the book and why omnipotence has become such a stumbling block for us.
Omnipotence is kind of the default view for most people who believe in God. At least that's the word they'll use, or they'll use sometimes another word that seems synonymous, like maybe sovereign or all-powerful or almighty. And I've had worries about this word for quite some time. As my book, God Can't, or The Uncontrolling Love of God, those books suggest that I think we should rethink God's power. But in this new book, The Death of Omnipotence, I decided to go right at the word. And I did so in part because I had discovered from doing biblical research that the words in Hebrew and Greek that were originally translated as omnipotent and now are typically translated as almighty, those words don't mean either one of those. Those words have to do with breasts, nourishing breasts, or mountains. They have to do with God holding things or being the Lord of hosts. And so I thought, wow, like the origin of this word is not biblical. And I already knew there was all kinds of philosophical problems with it. Most people who are professional philosophers know that you have to qualify the word. And I was realizing you have to qualify it so much that it seems to lose any real deep meaning. And then I'd already talked about the problem of evil. And if God is omnipotent, then why doesn't God stop evil? So this book was putting the word omnipotence in the bullseye. But even perhaps more importantly, after I wrote the book, God Can't, many people sent notes through social media and said things like, oh, finally, this is a picture of a God who I don't have to blame for causing or allowing what happened in my life. But, they said, how do I talk about God's action? What does God actually do if God can't stop whatever happened to me? And so the last chapter of this book, in which I roll out this new word, amipotence, A-M-I, ami for love, potence for power or influence, it's my attempt to give more flesh to the notion that God's power is uncontrolling love exerted throughout all creation at all times.
I like it. Do you guys hear my dog howling in the background? Holy cow, she doesn't normally do that, but she must like what you're having to say about omnipotence, the power of love. Yeah, it's relational. It's still power. It's just relational power, not authoritative power. That's how I think of it. How does that play out with what you do, Libby, in your work?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, where my little brain has taken a trail, along with my gut and heart intelligence, as Tom was unpacking the reason for the book just now, is actually to my kids. So I'm in this very interesting phase of parenting, and as open and relational theology gives us permission to be in becoming, these phases of parenting, it's the longest, shortest time, right? So the moments of being in the thick of parenting of littles in this particular phase can feel incredibly long and eternal days of working with little humans at a time. But of course, as you all know now of being grandparents and parents of different ages, it's the shortest time as well, because you blink and it's gone. And in the same way that these tiny little humans who come out very interdependent and very helpless, we don't have them to keep them, right? We grow babies to launch them, to launch them to be humans into the world. Where my head went was how unhelpful coercive parenting is.
Mm.
So coercive, control fixated parenting leaves me angry and dissatisfied and a frustrated heaping mess. And uncontrolling, love-based parenting allows me the freedom to guide my kiddos to be who they want to be. So I've been doing some really intensive work, but nothing else on planet Earth. Higher education, marriage, launching a brand new worshiping community. Nothing has opened sort of my wounded places psychologically like parenting has. And so I've really been pulling in resources over the past 6 years of being a parent to help me be a less coercive parent and a more loving parent. And so one of the things that I've been doing is giving myself mothering intentions, I call them, which are like breath prayers. And I've been passing on breath prayers to my kids. And one of them is, we can move through this together. So thinking about omnipotence as this very unhelpful framework for God, and amnipotence, loving potential, loving potency, loving power as the alternative to omnipotence. Where my mind goes is that phrase says, we can move through this together. So I'm a human being with big emotions and big feelings and big experiences during my day. And my 6-year-old, my 3-year-old are humans that have big emotions and big experiences during their day. So open relational theology says to me and them at the same time, we can move through this together because I'm in an intimate relationship with these little human beings, right? And so a question then that I want to pose based on this parenting analogy is, how do we unroot, for those of us that might be listening to the podcast that are still feeling the fear-based voice of omnipotent-based theology, either in churches that raised us or in ways that we've been taught about who God is? How do we unroot that fear-based omnipotence and replace it with this gift of loving potency? What do we do with that?
Mm-hmm. Great question. I think I want to start by trying to give a partial answer by telling a story about my own parenting and how I had an aha moment for why I don't think God is omnipotent in the sense of being able to control others totally. I was living in Southern California, doing my doctoral work, writing my dissertation on this subject, and my middle daughter, Alexa, was in the midst of her terrible twos. And we lived in this little house in Rialto, California. And my wife got up before I and the girls usually got up and went to work. And if my wife got up and thought the girls were sleeping, she would often leave the house without, kissing them, didn't want to wake them up or whatever. But if my terrible two, Alexa, heard the front door shut without mother giving her a kiss, she'd jump out of her little bed, go running down the hallway, screaming, and go to the front door and just bang on it. She couldn't open the door. She couldn't reach high enough, and she would throw a temper tantrum. Now, we tried all kinds of disciplinary actions to get her to stop to do this, but it just kept happening and kept happening. One morning, she got up and did this again. And what I did, I'm not recommending as good parenting, but I'm just telling you what happened. I went down, I picked her up, I took my finger, I shook it in her face, and I said, "You will not throw another temper tantrum." And I marched her back, put her in her bed, and because she was kicking and flailing me, I put one leg against her leg so she couldn't kick me. I took my arm around her two little arms so she wouldn't hit me. And then because she was screaming like a demon, I took my hand and put it over her mouth so she wouldn't scream. And in that moment, I thought to myself, even I can't control a 2-year-old. God surely can't control me. I had this theological insight. And what I've thought since that moment is that in that scenario, I actually had a body that could do some physical impact upon that 2-year-old. God doesn't even have a divine body to put his legs on my legs and her arms on my arms, etc. So the parenting stuff has helped me to see how some things are good analogies for God and some things aren't. And in fact, because I don't think God has a divine body, I can probably do some things as a parent to influence my kids that even God can't do. Now, I think God can call me to use my body to be God's metaphorical hands and feet, but that's a little bit different than being literally divine body. That's not really answering your question, Libby, but that moment back in Southern California was an insight to me to think about how a divine parent wouldn't have the capacity to control a creature who has some kind of agency, even if that agency doesn't include being able to control her little arms and legs and scream. It's like the kid of the old story who gets in trouble and his teacher says, "You got to sit down," and he keeps standing up. And so she says, "You're going to go to the corner and sit down." And he goes there and he thinks to himself, "I may be sitting down on the outside, but I'm standing up on the inside." And I think there's a way to talk about that agency that means that if we're going to honor the capacities we have as creatures, we need to rethink God's power in ways that don't claim God can be a controlling being. Because if we do, then we not only undermine our own agency, but then I think we end up implying that God must not be perfectly loving because God's not using that alleged abilities to stop the horrific evils in the world.
Right. And I think that why that revelation, it helps to answer the question, which is like, how do we uproot these unhelpful theologies that have demanded an omnipotent God? What it does is it naturally says, go with the lived experience.
Yep.
So, right. Not every human has chosen to be a parent. Not every human has had the opportunity to be a parent, even if they've wanted to be a parent. But most folks have encountered kids, and most folks have encountered a kid that is saying, "No way, Jose," in whatever form that looks like, whether it's the Alexa of her 2-year-old, "I want to say goodbye to my mama," or what I'm experiencing now with the way that my kids' own boundary setting and boundary holding is coming up for them. The lived experience says it can't be controlled.
Yeah,
so if it can't be controlled, then we need to apply that to the theological way that we perceive God and the way that we are in relationship to God, because a controlling God and a coercive God is a cruel God. And I can only imagine that after you sort of had that outburst of wanting to control Alexa's tantrum, that what you understood after that was her need to be connected to her mom. And we all have a need to be connected to the divine, right?
Yeah. Ooh, that's good. That's an angle I hadn't gone down, but I'm going to use that. Thank you.
I like how she said, "I'm
Me
sure that you thought of this, Tom." And clearly you hadn't. That was a really
had
sweet
not.
way of her putting that. Yeah.
I do think about this in terms of parenting. Like, I now have grandkids who I don't parent, but I still have obvious influence over. And of course, ideally, a parent wants to encourage and influence their children to make good choices by showing the advantages of the good choice. But sometimes you also have to point to the disadvantages or the negativity of a bad choice. And that can easily sound like a threat. And probably life has both influencing us toward good, but warning us toward what might be the negative consequences should we choose the bad. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because I think that's kind of the way life is. Of course, the problem is that we as human parents, we don't know life perfectly, and we're sometimes wrong about what the benefits are or wrong about what the potential negative consequences might be. So it's still an ongoing adventure as a parent.
And part of what you named there too is the agency that we want to instill in our kids,
right?
Which the agency of open and relational theology is the choice point that we have to borrow from the Native American wisdom story about feeding the good wolf or feeding the bad wolf, right? We have the opportunity, we're always at choice point to nourish the tendency in us to want good and follow good versus feed the bitter, evil, bad, selfish-based wolf. And another of my mothering mantras is mothering is not smothering, right? Because smothering is controlling, smothering is coercive, smothering is control fixated. Mothering is guidance. Mothering is offering the best way that I see in an adult body a series of choices to these kids that says we have the ability to solve for a solution here rather than react to a problem here.
Yep, I like that.
That's nice. I was trying to think, how could I use that? Fathering isn't clobbering.
Fathering is not forcing.
Oh,
what did you say?
I said fathering is not clobbering.
Because of that, because wasn't there a transition that said force to something, force to persuasion?
Persuasion, yeah. It works.
Yeah.
I have a very similar story. I won't share my story too, but when our daughter was 2 to 3, somewhere in there, and I remember where I was sitting, and I had the distinct thought, oh crap, I cannot control this little person. And then my next thought was, I must never let her know that I know that I can't control her.
And you know what's hilarious is like they already know that it too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think so.
Absolutely.
It does bring up interesting implications for when we think about God as a parent and us as children. You know, if you imagine God as a parent and us as a 1-year-old, then a controlling father seems a little more plausible. But if you imagine God as a parent and us as a 15-year-old, then you know there's no control there. And so I think a lot of people, when they hear about the parent-child relationship and say God is a good father, they imagine themselves as super young, and therefore God is really, pretty controlling. But a lot of the adoptions that happened in the ancient Near East were adoptions of teenagers, not, 1 day olds or 1 week old or something like that. So those adoption analogies in Scripture work better if we think of a parent adopting an older person who has real agency.
Well, also, I think a part of the reason that the religious ideological system that we come from lends itself to thinking of a 1-year-old is because so much of the time agency is sucked out of the equation in that context. Yeah. Like it's constantly, and most of the time they're well-intentioned. I don't think people do this for nefarious reasons, but it's that constant thing of like, I'm no good and God's the best and God's in control and I have no control, and die to myself and sacrifice myself and give myself up over and over and over. And there's a measure of truth with all of that, after a while, it just, it indoctrinates you to think, well, I am nothing. And so then when you talk about, actually, I do want God to force his way, because we think of ourselves as like helpless. But your point is we're not helpless. We got a lot of stuff going for us.
See, this is what happens, Jonathan, when you put out, 4 different ideas, we eventually get around to all 4 of them because they're all interrelated, right?
They are all interrelated. I would like to make a comment before we close I want to take a stab at part of Libby's question, which was how do we deal with that fear? Like, how do we, I don't know if you asked it this way, but reprogram ourselves I feel like a very consistent strategy that I use for myself and for lots of other people that almost never doesn't work is to try to address the shame thing. So in other words, if I have fear, what I don't recommend is that I immediately default and let the amygdala run with fear and more fear about the fear I just had, like shaming myself over having the fear, rather trying to say, no, Richard Rohr, it all belongs. Everything's here. Thank you, fear, for being here. You've served a purpose. You don't get to call the shots here, but I know you mean well. Like, just that whole approach is revolutionary for me personally, and systemically for the kind of Americanized Christianity that you probably have all dealt with too, but certainly me. Like, I've realized over and over that shame, holy cow, runs a lot of what's going on there. And I don't think it's healthy. I just don't think it's good.
Yeah. So, thanks for that, Jonathan. In my mental fitness coaching framework, there's an operating system that I use called positive intelligence that's based on cognitive behavioral psychology and neuroscience. And the whole operating system is bringing us to sage discernment or neutrality between the sabotage of fear and the activating agent of love. And that's what I hear in you saying that is like there is a sage sort of neutral space between the input of fear in our brains and our amygdalas, that as we teach ourselves that fear does not win, fear does not have the loudest voice, we can deprogram and unlearn those fear-based narratives and tapes in our head that have dominated the conversation, and then turn up the dial on love being allowed to say more.
Changing direction just slightly. I have a doctoral student named Shalene Kendrick who's doing her dissertation on 3 areas of intelligence: polyvagal stuff and open and relational theology. I'd love to send you some of her chapters just to get your feedback if you have some time.
I am open to that. Send all the nerdy biological stuff my way.
All right,
happy
cool.
to do it.
Well, that's appropriate because Shalene's going to be a co-host when we talk to Dr. Marge Suhaki.
Excellent.
Awesome.
I know, pretty cool. Well, clearly we could go a lot longer, but my attention span's gone. I like you guys, but I just can't do it anymore, man.
If it's gone for you, it's gone for your audience. So I think we came what we aimed to do.
That's right. No, I'm trying to be funny. It's not totally gone, but I know we all have stuff to do, and love both of you. Thank you very much for hanging out with me today. And everyone, I hope you'll check out Tom. Again, just get on the Google, look for Thomas Jay Oord. He's got books.
Check out, would you ask me a question?
No, I haven't asked you anything.
Oh, I thought you said you stopped, and I thought you were waiting for my response. Sorry.
No, maybe, no. I'm trying to wrap it up, Tom. If you could just
sorry. Just cut that out of the podcast. I've given you more work by.
No, I'm not editing. We're just going straight to it. No, I was encouraging people to find you on the internet and to find out stuff that we're doing. We got a Persuade Open and Relational preaching conference coming up in April, and this episode should drop before that. So that's in Denver. And then we've got the OrtCon in July. We've got other things planned later in the year. So I hope people will find you and read your books, and Libby as well. Okay.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Libby.
Thank you so much. Joy to be with both of you.
Peace.